Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single short story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, here today with Matthew Schmidt.
Howdy.
And Adam al-Sirgany.
Hey there.
Today we'll be discussing Stand Your Skin from Colin Barrett's debut collection, Young Skins. First published in Ireland in 2013 by Stinging Fly Press and later in 2014 by Jonathan Cape, an imprint of Random House Group Limited. Young Skins was a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree and winner of the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, the Guardian First Book Award, and the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. The story opens like this. Bat is hung over. Bat is late. These two clauses, separated by a comma, not a period, emphasize the connection between these two conditions. We move forward from there. We see Bat's workplace, the Maxall service station. We meet the store's manager, Duncan, and Bat's two younger co-workers, Tane Moonen, 15, and Rob Haggerty, 18. We see Bat and his co-workers get through that day at work. They share a joint Heg's brought along. Heg invites Bat to his send-off party at the Yellow Belly. And Bat's too hungover to come up with a good excuse not to go. We see Bat and his co-workers get through. He lives with his mother, who he refers to as the old dear. Through scene and flashback, we learn more about their home life and Bat's past. The old dear cuts hair. Most of her clients are the youngest offspring of her extended family. Bat has a chrome blue Honda 150 bike he likes to ride around. He drinks a six-pack on the roof most nights, which seems to be at least in part self-medication. He took a boot to the face, Nubbin Tainsey's boot to be specific, and he had to have 6 separate operations. 92% articulation was recovered, and now he's left with a crooked droop to the mouth, migraines, frozen muscles, blown nerves. We see Bat, who no longer socializes in town, and full stop, attend Heg's party, and from there things get drunken, sloppy, and problematic, as they often do in this collection. There's more context I could offer, but let's try starting there. Oh gosh, how would you two describe the setting and general atmosphere of this town?
Skeezy. It makes me think of a fairly poor town, although that could be completely wrong. But it feels very like everyone knows everyone else, and so it's got to be small-ish. And the way the opening bathroom is described, that Bat uses to get ready for work, which is in the service station that he's at, is pretty nasty. I would say it feels a bit misanthropic, even though people go out and talk to each other. There seems to be a lot of hatred between families, and all of these families are kind of like extended families living close together. And so, for example, Bat likes a couple of cousins more than he likes generally the rest of his mother's family.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description. I don't know that I have anything terribly significant to add other than it, right? Obviously it's an Irish town. I've never been to Ireland, so this is a terrible explanation, but because we're sort of at a sort of service station type place, I do imagine the place being right. Like at one point, he comes into work and he's getting dressed down for not covering up his arm tats. And his boss is asking him to, in the future, wear sleeves underneath his shirt. And meanwhile, they're sort of putting him into the back and like keeping him away from the customers because of the potential offense of the arm tats. So I think that it's both, right? Like it's both a small town and presumably a fairly conservative one, or at least the kind that fosters a certain kind of conservative manager of a sort of like service station place. In my head, right, like I keep thinking of it as being like, if you sort of, I lived in St. Louis for a while, and if you travel south of St. Louis, you know, you just head into that like deep Missouri like roads heading into the mysterious south. There's a lot of highway with terrible billboards, and then you can go into a service station and they're always a little bit strange, and an odd mix of people who will openly talk to you about doing meth and like for no reason at all, and who might in the same breath like ask you to pray with them, not about their meth use. And I think that there's something about that vibe to this joint for me.
Well, I did look this up today because I was interested. According to the, I believe, 2016 census, 78% of Ireland is Roman Catholic.
Wowza.
Yeah.
Well, I think those are some good broad strokes. Part of why I ask is this collection is a little bit like, you know, a sort of Winesburg, Ohio type collection in that it's circling around the same space and coming back to certain repeat characters. And, you know, I think it's important to like get the feel of that place in a general sort of way to understand the collection as a whole, but also how its parts are working. So moving to this story a little more specifically, I'm curious, what did you notice about the story's structure and pacing? Do you think the early scenes and the backstory given prepare you for, I guess, what I'd call like the climactic bar scene?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the answer is yes and no for me. I feel like I'm stuck on this word lately, but there's a pretty high level of sort of verisimilitude to reality in this story. And I think that what the early scene does, or the early scenes do, is really set up a sort of day in the life experience of what it is to be Bat, and how Bat's days sort of unfold, including the fact that there's something significant and entirely insignificant about the summer ending and the school year beginning, right? Like insignificant in that, like, he doesn't plan to really change to do anything. He'd rather not go to this party. But he also does like both of these coworkers who are about to bail on him. And he's got feelings about that, which are going to drive the story. I don't know that the climactic bar scene is the thing that surprises me. I think there's a process of really remarkable empathy in this story, both with Bat and with some of the people around Bat. And we're going to get into it later, but I think the early scenes, they build for the occasion of sort of asking the question of why is Bat like Bat is, in terms of his face, in terms of what's going on with him. And we get some of those answers in that bar scene. And I think there's something very truthful about the fact that he doesn't get the girl in the end. He doesn't, like, nothing spectacular happens to him. He just goes to this shitty, like, young person's drunken night. And I think that, like, that lack of change is something that, like, I sort of expect out of the character we get in the beginning, but the way we get there gives me something transcendent over time.
Yeah, I think the backstory does prepare me. I don't know that I would say the bar scene was climatic myself, only insofar as nothing really happens that is surprising. It is a bar after all. And maybe the most surprising thing is how Bat was injured initially. And while that story happens in the bar, like, we already know about Bat's injuries. And so it's not like a shocking kind of thing. I think what's shocking is that he was injured by a guy that was 5'2". Like, that's the shocking.
That's the shocking part to you?
Well, that and the fact that he, like, flies off of his table to kick him in the head, but it's like done cartoonishly when it happens.
Yeah, I think what shocks me is that, like, it's an entirely unprovoked assault. I like that's the key thing here is that like it's just the fact that a very short man, a muscular jockey, I think is how he's described.
Jockey on steroids.
Oh, jockey on steroids. Who just hates the world, decides to, and himself, just gets drunk, and when told to get off of a counter where he was dancing, cartoonishly, claims that he's going to kick in the head of the next person there, and manages to do it.
Yeah, but here's the thing: like, it's 6 feet away. Like, he's like 6 feet from the door. Like, somehow he has to get power behind. Like, he's on a counter. It's not like a running start. You know what I mean? Like, he somehow leaps. And he's wearing, like, I don't know, Doc Martens or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, there's all that jigging that happens. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little.
Yeah.
Let's take yeah, I mean, what a scene that is. Laughing so hard. Could you guys briefly summarize the story's action before we get to the Yellow Belly, which is the bar again, guys, and at the Yellow Belly? Let's not go past there for now. I think we'll get to that and other questions.
Yeah, anyway, to go back to the beginning. So we see Bat, like, first pull into work and, like, go to the restroom and try and straighten himself out because he's hungover. He's got a headache. And I think, kind of thinking about your last question a little bit, like, it's very telling that there's a daddy long legs in the sink, and Bat very clearly doesn't smash it or wash it down the drain, but, like, helps it kind of get off the sink. So he saves the spider. And, you know, that goes to kind of what type of person he is. And he's generally a pretty quiet person, minds his own business, he's not, like, looking for revenge from what happened to him. And mostly he enjoys riding his motorcycle around, which is how he got to work. And he takes it out after work and drives around because he loves how it feels like he's one with the turns and the motorcycle and that sort of thing. So like that's what really like excites me. We also learn generally about this service station and a little bit about Tane and Heg. Basically, he goes into work, boss dresses him down a little bit, but not that badly. And Bat's response is like, man, everybody knows me here anyway. Like, I can cover up the tattoos, but they've seen them. But the boss is trying to be professional in some sort of way that makes him feel better about what he's doing. And on the first break, the three younger people, Tane, Heg, and Bat, smoke a joint, and we get some background about them. Basically, Heg is in college. He's working over the summer. He's about to go back, and he's turning 19. And so his birthday's coming up, and this is when he invites Bat to the party. We learn that Tane is 15, and she's going to school at a convent, and she's starting like her junior year at the convent. Anyway, that happens. They go back to work. And the next scene, like Bat goes home and his mother, who he refers to as Old Dear, is cutting the hair of two distant, maybe, relatives in the house and smoking a cigarette with the door open. And she has a very distinct way of cutting their hair. She does them both at the same time, but she'll do like one side of one's head and then one side of the same side of the other's head. And so it's like a very strange scene. And Bat eats his dinner, like standing up at the counter, having a conversation with these relatives. And, we get a lot of backstory about what Bat looks like, what his face looks like, his drinking on a daily basis, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. What I might add, sort of, that we get, right, like we get the daddy long legs not getting murdered by Bat. I don't know. It's not really murder. She killed the daddy long legs. Is it?
I mean, not in the court of law.
Yeah. But we don't get that moment of Bat being violent. We also get sort of other moments of insight into Bat in those early scenes that are small, right? Like, we know that Bat is aware of a specific change after one weekend about 3 weeks ago between Heg and Tane, and right, and that he speculated on it, right? That he has Googled the specific terms of statutory rape, thinking about those possibilities and worrying them out. So I think we both learn about his imagination and concerns through that. But we also get the sort of way he thinks about the people around him in sort of not clinical terms, but maybe like slightly categorical terms, right? Like, he has that thought and then shortly after thinks about the fact that Heg hides the butt of their joint, right? And it makes Bat think that Heg is a careful person. And so maybe he hasn't done anything he shouldn't have done. He has these moments of half memory about relatives, right? Like, he's looking at these bullet-headed boys getting their head sort of trimmed in this like bizarre fashion. And he, right, like both has a sort of half memory of their christening, but also has the sort of present memory and like sharp wit to sort of tell a joke about their mother finding them a new brother and sister, or sister, when he finds out that the mother is at a bar. Right. So, I mean, there's something sort of interestingly acerbic about Bat, and but also perceptive in a kind of limited way. And I think that the pieces of that start to come together early on.
Yeah, I think you two do wonderfully talking about that. It's a long story. It kind of sprawls, but I mean, it's one that, I think structurally, I feel like it does do a lot of that preparatory work in terms of pointing you to things that may add up to something. But at the same time, I know on first read for me, like, I wasn't quite sure, especially in like the first scene, the daddy long leg scene where Bat is just getting to work. I wasn't quite sure where this story was going and why we were starting where we were starting. And some of the movements even felt a little disorienting. I felt much better oriented on second read. And I mean, I think I really enjoyed both reads. One wasn't, better or worse. It was just kind of different. But I've been getting ready for this moment of story talk where I get to go no 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 Batman. How does Bat get his nickname? And in what ways is the story in conversation with Batman, the comic, the TV series or series, the movies, whatever it is that you two know about Batman? And can we be sure to say a little bit about Bat's appearance here?
I'm going to desperately dive on this question first because I'm not a comic book nerd like Matthew is. So my Batman knowledge is limited.
Get your few points in. Okay. Sounds good.
So Bat actually gets his name from his last name, which is Badigan. That's right. Sorry. And also because he has shitty eyesight. And so it's sort of, a casual name, but also like picking on him for his pre-existing, incapabilities or differing capabilities, if you will. Actually, after his injury, he's briefly called Sly because the kids connect him with Sly Stallone. And they're like picking on him for his beat up face, and he's glad that hasn't stuck and that everyone knows him as Bat. As to how this connects to Batman, having never read the Batman comics, I would say that, right, like Batman's motivation for taking on Gotham's dark and evil folk, as I understand it, is the murder of his parents. And in some ways, I think Bat is actually the anti-Batman because he has no impulse toward vengeance, even though he's glad that his assaulter is dead. And I think also because, right, like there's something sort of the character Two-Face in Batman, that like in Batman, a lot of the people who are the bad guys have some kind of deformity. The Penguin is fat in a weird way and has a high-pitched voice, right? The Joker is mentally ill. Two-Face has a damaged face. And I think that in that way, Bat's sort of interestingly the not evil, deformed person you know, who also hasn't acquired any like superpowers as the result of getting damaged. So that's my limited and pathetic insight into Batman.
I believe I also told you about his parents getting murdered.
You totally did. I wouldn't.
Anyhow, one note I'd like to make before the Batman question is that having read a number of European novels that came out, I don't know, probably 90s through the present, is that a lot of those stories feel kind of like this, in that you feel displaced on a pretty regular basis. I'm thinking of The Wasp Factory, The Butcher Boy, Sheepshagger. Those are all from authors in Europe around that area, around Ireland-ish. And so I think a lot of those novels are really dark, and perhaps that is some sort of response to the kind of, I don't know, romantic period, or like the high-mindedness of some of the longer, very like polite society novels that came out in Europe, you know, in the earlier 20th century, for example. So just a note. I don't have like a big thesis on it at the moment, but I have noticed that. As far as Batman goes, like he doesn't really have much in common with Batman. You're right about that.
Nailed it.
He like, first of all, Batman's rich. His family's rich, and this bat is working at a service station. Like perhaps the closest he comes to Batman is riding his motorcycle. Insofar as like Batman often rides a motorcycle, especially in the movies. But there is, I noticed, a very distinct color yellow throughout this story that I find really interesting to think about with bats. Like just picture a regular bat, like a drawing of a bat. Like often they give them yellow eyes or something like that. And like in this story, we've got the yellow belly, which is the bar. We've got the marigold gloves that Bat wears when he's working with the chicken in the service station. And
Oh man, the gloves. I didn't even think of that one. That's good.
there's one other thing. I'm trying to think of what the third thing was that I remembered, but there's one more in the story that I'm blanking on at the moment.
If I can help, there's the dream moment, the dream sequence where I think he's in a yellow suit that doesn't fit.
Yeah, that's it. You got it.
Well, is the suit yellow or does it just not fit?
Well, it's yellow. Yeah.
It's
No, it's yellow and it's like flopping off of his
Oh
arms.
yeah, it's mustard seed. Yeah.
Yep,
Mhm.
it's both. That was the third one. So like it's this strange like idea of bat being like the name bat making us think of predator, and this bat like being prey most of the time.
Mm.
So I think that's like the closest I have to like the relationship between the name, the idea of bats and Batman, and this bat.
Yeah, I think in a way, I started thinking about this more and more on second read, and it kind of, I think the way it engages Batman is a little bit like a dream, where things don't relate in this one-to-one kind of way, but where there are associations that if you sort of re-engage some of those, you know, the comics, the TV series, the movies, you start to connect dots, or at least I do. And some of them may be stretches that, you know, Barrett wasn't thinking of at all. And, you know, some may really be there. The one that was really big for me, where I started to think, oh, like maybe there are more of these, was actually the kick. Because I started to think about it and I was like, oh, like I have this vague memory of in the TV series, characters kicking and there being this like pow with a little, comic strip bubble, and like almost a break in the series. It really took me back to childhood in this way where I was like, oh gosh, could that be a connection? But likewise, even like Bat's long hair, Batman doesn't have long hair, but you start to think of like wings and things along those lines, I think, a little bit.
That's interesting.
But moving away from that, because I could ramble on clearly about other connections I'm having. Tane is really central to this story, I think, as a character, and it's a source of conflict across the story. Can you two talk a little bit about the tension that Barrett's built around her character in particular and age? And can you touch a little bit on Bat's sense of justice? Just to give you one more thing to do, the source of his power and what this story does with that power.
Can I ask what you mean by his power?
You can. I think what I mean by that is what he's most in control of and what he might identify as his strength.
Yeah, I actually think
Does that clarify a little bit?
A thought on this. So I think that Matthew and I were talking about this before we started recording, that I'm going to gloss over this, but I think a lot of the tension in the story is built around the fact that, Bat is, while too old for Tane, Bat, I think he would also like to be involved with Tane, right? But his sense of sort of morality involves sort of following the rules, but also like being kind to people, keeping out of folks' way. Some of that, like has this low grade appearance of being, when you're close to Bat, you're not always close to Bat. Toward the end of the story, you get into Tane's head briefly. You also get into Bat's mother's head. But being close to Bat, I think you experience some of that sense of injustice having been done by the world, and that there should be some kind of retribution, some kind of like solution, something that makes it okay, right? But Bat doesn't, like, something terrible happens to Bat, who is, by the one account we get, a pretty nice dude even before that, and Bat does nothing to like deserve what happens to him, and unfortunately he was poor and we're told ugly before that, as well as myopic, right? So real bummer for that dude, but it doesn't mean that like sort of summer love is going to come to him, or even like a modicum of happiness. And some of that sort of built out of, his one other connection to Batman is maybe that he just sits on a roof and looks for a signal in the sky, although it's not coming for him, right? Like he doesn't have that, right? Like late in the story, his mother is going to envision the possibility of him just getting drunk and rolling off the roof. I think what's interesting about this, and this is how power ties into all this, is that I think those of us who are sort of beat up or damaged, quote unquote, who, like, are second rate, like on somebody else's mind, have this potent ability to be a functionary in other people's success stories, right? Every shitty film about somebody who turns out to be a rock star at the end of the film has to be filled with a bunch of people applauding and paying attention to that person who's pretty and got the girl or the boy and who got all the money and acclaim and all the things that they deserved because they were clearly better than the rest of us. But the problem with that kind of sort of stock narrative, and we all tell ourselves those stock narratives, is that most of us think that there's still a hope that we're the chosen one, or that there's something remarkable and special about us, and that justice is going to be served when we're everybody's favorite and we get everything we want, so on and so forth. What happens to Bat at the bar is not just that Bat is missed, but that Bat is a showpiece a little bit. And that never becomes all that explicit, right? But Bat becomes a showpiece for his cousin. Bat becomes a showpiece for his coworker. Both coworkers. This, look how nice I'm being to this pitiful person who isn't pretty enough to look at, right? Or pretty enough to love. Look how, right, like interesting I am that I have a friend who looks so fugly, right? And that becomes utilitarian, right? None of us are impressive unless we have other people to be impressive over. None of us are important unless we have other people to be more important than, right? None of us are famous without, the infinite hordes of people to judge us who are clearly worse and less intelligent, less creative, and less talented than us. But, right, like, that kind of Marcus Aurelius shit is real, right? And I think that it's rare that instead of focusing on Marcus Aurelius, we focus on the plebes. And in this case, Bat is not only a plebe, but he's a particularly damaged plebe. And so we get a view from that perspective of someone who is going to get nothing. And for that reason, have the power to create room for other people to be delusionally more satisfied with themselves and their own sad narratives of being better than everyone else.
Yeah, no, I like that idea of power that you two are talking about. I think as far as Taine's character as a source of conflict, this story is populated almost exclusively by men. And the only other woman that is given any note besides the mother doesn't talk, right? So it's Taine, Bat's mother, who doesn't say like a whole lot.
Yeah.
And then Heg's girlfriend from college, we presume.
Right.
We don't really know. Who just glowers at everyone, doesn't speak, and at one point just starts making out with Heg. For whatever reason.
Yeah. Who also, I know this is an Irishism, but I do like is ridiculously referred to as that ride. Like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Smokes.
So anyway, the thing about Taine is that, like, she's young. We get the sense that she's pretty.
Yeah.
But she's also naive, and she's trying to operate in a world that takes advantage of naive girls. And so, like, the sources of conflict are that she's working with men, and the two men she's working with most closely both like her. And Heg, being the popular, good-looking one of the two, and much nearer her age, they probably hooked up or something happened. And so like that's already on the table. And Bat likes her, but is clearly, you know, closer to 15 years older than her, but also doesn't want to harm her. Like he's the one character in the story who's like, I'm going to try my best to be protective of her. And, you know, he even feels kind of ashamed when she sits next to him when they're on break. And he doesn't like to look at her directly. And when she comes to the bar later, dressed up with makeup on, he doesn't even recognize her at first, and then realizes that he's looking at her too long because he was surprised, but also he's still attracted to her and like gets caught up in that. And then his cousin Luke Minion basically is able to tell the story about how Bat was injured in order so that he can make out with Tane and probably more. And so like Tane's is drawing the interest of everyone, and things are happening a little too fast probably for her to process and make good decisions, I guess is a trite way of putting it, but true. And so like all of that conflict takes place like over like this week, with some stuff happening like before that is kind of recounted. But it puts all the men in a different position because of their lust and, you know, want to be with Tane.
Yeah, Adam, going back to something you were saying about power in this story and where it lives, I had a friend, Harvey, who was telling me about the filmmaker Kelly Reichardt's work, and Sea of Grass in particular. I think that's the title. Maybe it's River of Grass, but it's something like that. And I think Harvey has this unique ability for capturing like what a movie's really about and describing it in a way that like gets to the bottom of that, and just, you know, finds the heart of the story. And he was telling me that Sea of Grass or River of Grass, whichever it is very much about, it's sort of like a Bonnie and Clyde, but if the characters had no glamour and maybe they like turn the car around and their robberies don't succeed in the same kind of way. And I think in a way, like, this is Batman if, you know, his power is inaction and restraint and being a good guy, but a guy who actually has a face that's a little more like the Joker's or something like that. And, you know, Matthew, I think regarding Tane, that's so eloquently put. I think, yeah, things are happening quickly in this story, and it is a space where, you know, even older characters like that, I think, are struggling to make the decisions they want to in the Yellow Belly at the point that we're there. And, you know, I mean, I think things kind of all whirl together in such a way that you almost sort of forget some of the questions that you have. Like on first read, I remember thinking at the point that we get to the story of how Bat got his injury, and like the full story, that like I didn't even know how badly I wanted to know that as a reader until I was hearing it. And I was like, oh, like, this is what this story is about in so many ways. And other things also. But I guess going back to justice a little bit and the story's morality, I guess Bats in particular, what questions does this story seem to have about justice and morality? And I feel like this is too serious of a question to like roll this in, but I do want to go back to the kick.
Well, not unlike the Joker and Batman. The chaos that is caused by the kick is entirely arbitrary and created by someone who, at least if we can trust Minion's version of the tale, is right, like sociopathic, and just doesn't like himself or anybody else, right? Because he doesn't like himself, he doesn't want anyone else to like be able to operate, right? And can't live in the world with anyone. And I think that, right, like that's a pretty critical question, right? Like, because there is, right, there are things in the world that we do purely out of, right, like, because, well, our world is largely set up around an idea that there's some kind of justice, right? And clearly, justice doesn't work in a way for any of us that is purely that, right? Like, there's a power structure to justice, and the people who make the rules often make those rules to their own advantage, not recognizing or fully recognizing the disadvantage of other people or the inadequacies of what that is and the arbitrariness, the way those rules work. But when someone comes out and breaks the rules in such and such a way that evidences that they just don't care, then there's nothing like punishment that is going to fix the problem. But also, like, in many forms of, like, that's all abstract, but right, like in any form of damage, right, like there's no amount of like death of this other person that's going to fix Bat's face, right? There are circumstances, right, like he got kicked by someone who then committed suicide, right? Like Bat doesn't get to fulfill Bat's own justice in any way. There's no kind of apology that happens. There's no reward for his suffering. And I think the story wants to know something about that. But I think one thing that I'm really fascinated with, that the story seems to be asking also, is just because Bat's suffering doesn't mean that Bat is the only person experiencing an injustice, or that Bat's view on justice is somehow more saintly or correct than the rest of us, right? Coming off of Tane, this question makes me think of the moment when Bat comes out of the bathroom, by the way, vomiting, because, I'm going to interpret this as his social anxiety and depression leads him to drink far too heavily on a regular basis, but not crazy heavily. But in this social situation, he drinks, 3 beers to everyone else's 1, when everyone else at the table is 19 or whatever, and capable of putting away booze. And it makes him vomit that, and like having to face down the situation, presumably. All of that, maybe never slowing down to just sit down and eat or something. I don't know, right? He vomits. He comes out, he sees Minion making out with Tane. And while we never get an explicit moment where he says, "Man, I wanted my tongue down Tane's throat," I think that there's something troubling about his immediate go-to there, which is that like something about it looks coercive, which on the page, right, if this were in film, we could see something and interpret a little for ourselves whether or not it felt coercive, or whether or not it felt like a 15-year-old like moving on after, like trying to say like, haha, like, you've moved on to this pretty girlfriend, like moving on with this 30-year-old man or whatever. But we can't see that on the page, right? we get the interpretation that it might be coercive from another 30-ish-year-old man who would like to be making out with Tane. And so there's something a little like self-pitying about that justice, or that like morality, right? And so we get a portrait of even what the best character in the story, the sort of like most ethically pure, like sacrificial lamb in this story, still sees as, right, like morals, and they still come out of, you know, selfish disappointment. And I think there's a lot of questions there, and I don't know that the story has answers, but I think that turn to the mother at the end, that the mother getting frustrated with his fragility and an awareness of that, you know, is leaning into that question of what it is to live in a world, and how you live forward out of disappointment.
Yeah, I kind of think of this story as posing questions but not answering any.
Yeah.
And you know, the overarching theme seems to be that justice and morality are not clear cut, nor can they ever be clear cut, and different situations, circumstances, countries, places, like everyone, you know, has their own justice system, and it's all different if we look at the established ones, and it is always changing. Clearly, there's no consensus on what justice and morality is within the people on the earth. And so like, this is like, that's taking like a broad view of it, but like, the story does it on like this smaller town level, and asks that question of us. And you know, there's not really any likable characters in this story. Everybody's like, you know, either damaged, you know, trying to do things that aren't generally considered moral, complaining, or down on their luck, you know, and you could use any other, you know, adjective to describe these people, kind of. I would like to go back though and propose a hypothesis that it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. And that is perhaps the small man, who actually goes by the name Nubbin Tansy.
I knew you were going to say.
Who actually...
Nubbin, by the way, for those interested, does come up in at least one other story in this collection.
I mean, you know,
for those interested in Nubbin, there is more of him.
Oh, good.
Enough Nubbin to go around. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit from the story here to kind of attempt a possible reading of my hypothesis. This is Luke Minion telling Tane about Nubbin Tansy. He was one of those ones with nothing good in him. He was a fucking head case, paranoid, devious, a temper he couldn't turn down. Would kick the shit out of you at the drop of a hat, and I mean you. The mother of his kid wouldn't let him see the baby. He beat her to a pulp, cracked a bottle over her skull. He was one of them, couldn't stand being in his own skin, and couldn't stand the rest of us neither. Right, so this is the story that he's telling. Like, the narrator doesn't tell us, you know, like he committed suicide. And we're told earlier in the story that the minions are generally always in trouble with the law and are a bit violent in their own manner. And just like the kind of scene in the bar and the violence that has happened to Bat like all of this feels very violent. And so who's to say that he in fact did commit suicide? First of all, he's, I don't think it's unreasonable to say he committed suicide. It's very possible. I'm saying this is just a very violent character, and violent characters are followed by violence. And so it like almost doesn't matter whether he committed suicide or someone took care of him in possibly their own minds, meting out the justice they think Nevin deserves for any number of things he's already done. But like, that's just another way to say the story's giving us information that asks more and more questions about what is just, about what is moral.
Yeah, I was curious to see where you two would go with this question, and tried to keep it sort of purposefully broad, because I think this story is worried about a lot of different things with regard to justice. I mean, even like how we get to the pow kick scene, is, he just decides that he's going to kick the next person who walks in, which already is setting us up for a sense of like what happens in this space is going to be random and undeserved. Whoever gets this kick hasn't been chosen for it, hasn't done anything that, merits getting kicked in the face in this way. Not that anyone deserves that anyway, but I mean, other than walking through the door. But, I think, especially with regard to that, I feel very primed as a reader to admire and be sympathetic to his restraint and, his want to go to the library and look up what statutory rape is, and, kind of not objectify or take advantage of Tane, who I think he also sees as a friend. That said, I think, when I think of going back to my question about where his power, where I see him having power, I think it is a power that's about restraint. Like, he doesn't kill the daddy long legs. He doesn't look at Tane in certain ways, but at the point that maybe like what's happening to her is problematic, he doesn't step in and do anything about it. And I mean, like Adam said, that moment is murky. He's been drinking a ton. He has feelings for Tane that aren't worked out. So I mean, we don't know as readers if it would be appropriate for him to step in exactly. Certainly, if we're thinking about statutory rape, yes. Resounding yes. But I mean, does Tane want that in that moment? To what extent is she feeling coerced? At 15, of course, you always are. Not in a position to be old enough in the law's eyes to be making that kind of decision. But, I think the story's engaging that in really deep and, messy, drunken, crazy ways. So I guess thinking about, that scene and some of the story's final scenes, where does this story leave us? And what do you make of the ending and the dream that precedes it in particular?
Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? Like, the phrase "stand your skin," I'm often not like as concerned with titles as other people are. I think sometimes they're just a thing we put at the front of a story. But in this case, right, like what we learn about Nevin Tansey from the section that Matthew read for us is that he couldn't stand his own skin, and he couldn't stand the rest of us either. And you know, Bat can't stand his own skin, and can't really stand the rest of us either. He just wouldn't kick the shit out of you, which is a pretty significant thing. And we follow Bat for the better part of the story, very, very on the shoulder of Bat. And we get these significant images, right? Like the thing I mentioned earlier on is, so the first time Bat interacts with anyone in the story, he's told to cover up his skin, which is covered up by tattoos. One of the first images we get of Bat is taking off the helmet that's covering the face that's so troubling to him and everyone else, and then letting down hair that's covering a bunch of Bat. Like it's ungodly long hair, right?
It's down to his bro.
Indeed. You know, I think that in that way, there's something really relieving, right? When we start to get the dream sequence, right? Like that takes us out of Bat, right? Bat is nerve-wracking, and what's sort of dream-like is also nerve-wracking. It feels like anxiety-producing imagery. I'll let Matthew say more on that, but I think it's the first time that I'm not just sort of fatuously going like, "Oh, poor Bat," right? What a nice guy, right? But I realized, like, fuck, man, I'm so glad to be out of like Bat's miserable head for a minute. And that I recognize, right, that kind of odd process of being around people like who are sad and violent and like what have you. And we get that moment of breath, right? I think it's significant for that reason too, that we end up with the old deer, right? And we get to see her, and we get to see how she thinks away from all of this other stuff. And it makes it all both seem so petty and so sad, and also makes her life seem so petty and so sad. That like the two things she's concerned with, I mean, she's concerned with his safety and well-being. She wants him to be happier. She admits to herself that she's sometimes frustrated with him because he's such a sad sack. And then she worries about how she can't predict if like that she, you know, it's a mother's job to, you know, like her duty and out of morality is to protect him as her son. And she did that, and she's doing that, like worrying about him sort of ridiculously falling off the roof in a cartoonish way. But there's no way for her to predict. And she failed to predict the absurdity of a steroidal jockey leaping 6 feet to land a perfect jaw shot on someone. And I think that, right, like it's both the relief of that kind of like swings it all back, and like the sort of odd horror of the world. I mean, you mentioned Winesburg, Ohio earlier, right? Like it is a book of, like Winesburg, Ohio, it's a book of grotesques, right? But I think it also, you know, gives us a moment to reflect on that otherwise sort of meandering story, and to sort of make sense of all of the drunkenness and the kind of like displacement and like disillusion and dissatisfaction and aimlessness, and look at someone with purpose who, in a world of aimless, disillusioned, disaffected people, cannot do the thing that she needs to do. And I think there's something sort of remarkable about that relief that also like throws me back into the world sort of gratefully, and invites me to feel my feelings about all of this fucked up shit that just happened.
Yeah, I think my reading is somewhat similar, and that the story is, well, like, so his mother, the old dear, basically dreams about the possible ways he can die, and thinks it's her job to like suss out all of those possibilities so that they don't happen, to somehow protect him from the world. And you know, then she wakes up and she kind of she like goes in and out of sleep, and she's sitting in front of the TV. And later she wakes up again and doesn't know who she is or where she is or what's happening. She finally remembers, and she starts calling for Bat, whose actual real name, which we haven't mentioned, is Eamon. And she's the only one that calls him Bat. So, and she's literally the closest person to him. And they are also both kind of, they don't really talk about things, you know. And I think the thing that the ending leaves us with is that, like, we are, as human beings, we are given the opportunity to be alive, whether you want it or not. And it's your choice how you view that particular circumstance. Are you going to be happy-go-lucky? Are you going to be down in the dumps? Where are you going to fall in between those two scales? Because there's any number of, you know, outlooks that one could take. But, you know, the thing about being human is that we rely on one another to see who we are. And like, she doesn't know who she is without her son, no matter what kind of situation he's in. And she just needs to know where he is. She wants to know what he's thinking, what she can do to help him. But like, while we need other people to kind of gauge who we are and what to do and why we should do things, like, we're still, like, the story says, you know, stand your skin, but the skin is really the mind, in my mind, in that it's not your skin necessarily that you can stand, it's your mental reaction to yourself and how others view you. That is the real thing. And then the question is, well, what, depending on what your situation is, what do you do with that?
Fucking
In our last episode of Story Talk, we were thinking up fairy tales a little bit, and I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned about the collection as a whole is, you know, it is interested in folklore and magical things. This story is actually one of, I wanted to do something from this book, partly because we were coming off the fairy tale episode. I actually ended up choosing one of the stories that's most worldly, finally, that's the least magical. I mean, we have an improbable pow kick, and you know, other things that are a little bit strange in this one, but I mean, it is one that, it is a story that's certainly engaged with surreality, dream spaces. I think, Matthew, you know, all you say about the ending is so on point. And in terms of like standing your own mind, in the lead up to the ending, Bat's recurring dream is, we talked a little bit about this in passing, but he's wearing this mustard seed suit and it's outsized. That's what his mother calls it in the dream, the suit. And he's walking around, and I mean, it's repeated, the suit does not fit. It's several sizes too large, and it's talking about the kind of like billowy quality of the suit and the way in which that's sort of comical. And the old dear, his mother, is like pursuing him, saying, change the medication, change the medication. And there's something about like that hinging, I think, in the ending toward this other dream. But I mean, the preoccupation remaining really the same, like the mother chasing after him, saying like, don't die in this way. And him feeling like his skin doesn't fit, his suit doesn't fit, and it's billowy, and there's this mystique about it. And, he is this showpiece character that you'd want at a bar because he's a freak, but a fascinating freak in his way. But, he feels he's wearing that suit, and he's wearing it throughout the story in all these different ways that you mentioned, the helmet, the hair, how he's moving through space. So yeah, on that lofty note, should we end by just mentioning the Rabbit Mural?
There are demented rabbits involved in this story.
Apparently, the muralist had a hard time spacing the eyes of the rabbits, and they're all cross-eyed. And it's on a wall outside the service station. And so they see it like every day.
Yeah, it's like if Bob Dylan met Casey's. Well, thanks guys so much for doing this one with me.
Thank you for bringing it to us.
Thanks, Ingrid.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.